Welcome to this session of Getting to Know the Bible, how it's put together, small group. Today we're going to do the second in our sessions, and this is going to be in regards to the first 5 books of the Bible. And again, I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong. The Pentateuch. Yeah, you're going to have to look that one up to get the pronunciation correct. It's also known as the Torah as well. That might be a word that you've heard around in different religious settings as a name for it as well. But this is the first 5 books of the Bible. We're going to go into them a little bit more in detail than we did in the overview. And we're also going to show you roughly some pictures and maps where this roughly took place. So the first 5 books of the Bible were the Torah, and I'm just going to refer to that so I don't butcher the name. Is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. We're pretty familiar with these as we started to memorize these, like we said earlier back in Sunday school. But we're going to get into each book and how it was part of the Bible. As I said in the overview, it's kind of like a compilation of books, poems, history, all wrapped up into one book that we call the Bible. These individual books mean certain things and can be looked at, even though they're grouped this way, they're kind of looked at individually as certain sections of a book, kind of like an encyclopedia of sorts, as I had mentioned before. So if we can kind of look at it like that, we can understand the Bible a little bit better maybe than we have in the past, where we just look at it as a book. You start in page 1 and you end at the last page of the Bible. So there's the first 5 books. This is the 5 books we're going to be talking about today, and kind of go over them individually. The way the book we're using is designed, we kind of give you the same format for each book, so it's kind of detailed. We'll start out with Genesis. Great place to start since it's the beginning of the Bible. Who wrote it? Moses. Moses wrote Genesis. Now, and this is where we start to understand how the Bible was put together and arranged and written. Obviously, Moses wasn't there in the beginning. It was Adam and Eve. So he was inspired to write this by God. So we understand that this was further along in history than some of the events took place. Obviously, some of the events that we're going to discuss or go over deal with him and during his time on earth. However, some of it did happen prior to that as well. Genesis deals with the beginnings, hence the meaning of the word, and the beginnings that we are familiar with, the creation of earth, and so forth. The 7 days that, the 6 days that God created the earth, and the 7th day that he rested. Where did this take place? It took place in Egypt and Canaan. At the end of this session, we'll show you some pictures and maps that will kind of clear that up for you a little bit. And when was it written? Now, this is something that I have to think about in my head, and maybe some of you do as well. We're talking about years. As far as years, we think they increase in number, but that is AD, after his death, as opposed to BC. So BC, we start out, and we'll talk about this also again towards the end, at roughly 2200 BC, at least this book goes back for. As we start to get closer to when Christ was born, the number's lower. So we go 2200, and then we start to 2199, 2198, and so forth. So the area or time this was written, and this was it within Moses' lifetime of a span of about 40 years, was 1446 BC to 1406 BC. Why was it written? To show God's love for his creation that he created, as we saw here in the beginning, with the creation in the 6 days and resting on the 7th, and his sovereign power over. He is the Almighty God. So kind of the summary of that. A lot of things happen within Genesis, the book of Genesis, events-wise that we're familiar with many times with a lot of the stories we heard growing up in Sunday school. The chapter breakdowns as you're going through the chapters of Genesis. The first 11 chapters are the creation. Obviously, we just discussed that a few times. the fall when Adam and Eve were thrown out of Eden, and then the Great Flood. We talk about Noah. This is in Noah's time as well that this book is recording. So we talk about the Great Flood as well. In chapters 12 to 25, we discuss Abraham, and then we get into Isaac and Jacob in 26 to 36, and then we get into Joseph, 37 to 50. And again, these are some of the stories that we remember from Sunday school, some of the highlights within the Genesis, and it kind of brings us back to kind of the order for which it happened in. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit later with a slight timeline that we'll discuss. Exodus. I know at least myself, when I hear Exodus, I'm thinking, okay, the Ten Commandments. Probably because in Sunday school somewhere along the way we had to memorize Exodus was the area or location where we found the Ten Commandments. More than likely had to memorize them at some point in time, or try to memorize them at some point in time, so we knew what God's law was for us. Who wrote this? Again, Moses. Okay, spoiler alert. Moses wrote all of these 5. So you will see a lot of redundancy with the who wrote and the years, because this is roughly the time frame he wrote these books. It was about the deliverance from slavery. So again, if we go back into our Sunday school time, we remember that Israelites were captive in Egypt, and Moses was sent to free them. So that's kind of in the area we're talking about here with Exodus a little bit. Where did it take place? Obviously Egypt, and then Canaan as well. So kind of in that area of the world. Why was it written? To show God's faithfulness to the covenant that He has given to us, and give Israelites guidance for how to live. We're always talking about the Bible as kind of like a roadmap on how to live. This is what God was writing, or God was writing through Moses in Exodus, and shows how faithful He was and how He did free the Israelites from bondage. The chapters, as they break them down, the first 7 are about Moses, and again, the birth of Moses going forward, the plagues of Egypt. Many of us remember the different plagues, the blood in the Nile, the locusts, the frogs, and so forth. They are listed in 8 to 13. The Exodus, hence the name of the book, kind of fitting, where they leave Egypt, they're freed from bondage. And then the Law, 19 to 24, and this is where the Ten Commandments come into play. This is where the Ten Commandments are given to Moses on Mount Sinai. And then the Tabernacle and Worship rounds out the end of Exodus at chapters 25 to 40. Leviticus, again, Moses wrote it. It's about laws and sacrifice. It was supposed to help, and I don't have the time down here. I didn't pop that in there of when, but it's the same, the 1446 to 1406 BC, again, written by Moses. It was taking place in Sinai and Canaan. Why was it written? To give instructions to the Israelites on how to be holy and a blessing to others. And as you remember from the Ten Commandments and your neighbor, kind of dovetails into this as well. Alright, Levitical outline of the chapters. Sacrifice, 1 to 14, how to do that. The priesthood, 8 to 10. Being clean and unclean, 11 to 15. The Day of Atonement, 16, one chapter on itself. And then laws of daily life, from 17 to 27. Again, written to give us instructions on how to be a blessing to others and how to be holy and kind of live the way God wants us to live. Numbers. Everybody kind of laughs about this book sometimes. They're like, Numbers. Yeah, this got to be an interesting book. Numbers, as you see, Moses again wrote this, same time frame. What is it about? History and census. So if you're a history buff, it might get you excited. If you're into numbers and census, that might excite you. Otherwise, might not be as exciting as some of the other books of the Bible. However, A lot of important things here with history and census. We talk about the census. We think about with the birth of Jesus, and Joseph and Mary had to go to Bethlehem to be counted in the census for taxes. Well, this obviously isn't the first time a census was done. Also, recording of numbers and history and family trees that we'll talk about later on, and how they sprout out into the different tribes of Egypt and so forth is very important as well. It's a reminder to God's people as to what happens when they rebel against Him, and I know I'd said in a sermon that I had done before, it's interesting, and there's a great pictorial in the book that I'm using. It's a revolving circle. People are happy with God, they're doing what they're supposed to do, then they turn against God, then problems come, and then they turn back and cry out to God, and then they do what they're supposed to do, and it's kind of like a revolving circle. And this is a reminder to people that, unfortunately, if this was done back in this time frame, you see it continue throughout the Bible, and unfortunately today, where we don't necessarily always get the hint and do the right thing that we're supposed to be doing. So it's a reminder what happens when we do rebel against God. The chapters broken down into census, the first 9 chapters. Sinai to Canaan, 10 to 12. Spies and rebellion. We also talk about spies. If you can remember this time era, they sent spies into the promised land to see what was there. There was rebellion. And then we finally wrap it up with chapters 20 to 36 with Moab. And this was an Aryan time and group that is final or finished up. They talk about in Numbers, and also a city which you'll get to see as well. All right, the last book of the Torah, Deuteronomy, again written by Moses, same time frame. It includes sermons by Moses, so it's kind of neat. Sermons took place back this far. It's kind of neat to go back and look at the sermons and I guess could compare it to a sermon of today that you've heard in the modern church. It takes place on the plains of Moab. We'll get to see the kind of area, not just in this book where it was located and where it is today, but the whole kind of travel from where Moses started talking all the way till now. It was written to remind people of what God expects of them. And again, being obedient to God and following the commandments that He had set forth to Moses earlier in his life. Chapters are broken down into 3 sermons and then kind of like a parting farewell of thoughts at the end there. So a journey of review, the laws, the covenant, and the final farewell, and kind of like a wrap up to his time and the ending of the Torah here with the 5 books of the Bible. All right, to try to bring it in perspective to the history of today. Like I said, this book starts at about 2200 BC, and with Abraham kind of being one of the first figures they discuss and we talk about, 2166 to 1991 BC. And again, remember, we're dropping down in years as we get more current in time. Moses, 1526 to 1406. So the last 40 years of his life is when he actually wrote these books, or was inspired to write these books. First Passover, if we remember the bondage out of Egypt, the day before they were released, we had the first Passover. This also encompasses the last of the plagues, where the firstborn was killed by the death angel, unless the blood was lamb's blood was painted on the doorway of the home, and that's how that was Moses' plea to God to save some of those firstborn of the Israelites. 10 Commandments, approximately 1460 BC. It was on the timeline, so it was tough to get the exact, but approximately 1460 BC. So towards the end of Moses' life, I guess the last 54 years or so of his life, roughly when the 10 Commandments were written and given to him by God. So that kind of gives you a timeline of roughly where in world history these things took place. Alright, I wanted to show you a little pictorial, and I didn't copy it the greatest, but if you look over to the far right, you see, well actually I'm sorry, let's start about the middle to the right. You see Canaan, and that's where these start. Egypt and Canaan. Egypt's all the way over further, and you'll see that in the next picture better, but we have Canaan there. If you go over to the right a little bit, you'll see the waterway. That's the Jordan, and then the Dead Sea, and just to the right of the Dead Sea is where we have Moab that's just cut off there. So you kind of see the area in which this was and some of the other things. And this is kind of a map of back then. Opposed to a combination map here where you see Egypt on the bottom left. That's Egypt of today. And then you see the wilderness where they crossed over and went through for the 40 years. Continue over to the right, you see Moab, a little bit better there, and the plains of Moab where Deuteronomy takes place. And a little bit more of the area where they were. So this is a overview of the location of where things were discussed within these 5 books. Alright, and here's the book that we are using. Again, you don't have to get it. The author does give us permission to reproduce for classroom purposes. I am going to see if I can get a little bit extra permissions there for this course by writing to him. But that's where we're getting this information from. If we do add any other information from other sources, they'll be listed here as well, so you guys can refer to them if you're interested in that as well. Alright, I hope you found this informative. This again is the second session. We'll get in and connect with the historical books next for the next session in 2 weeks. So do us a favor, leave a comment, thought on what you've heard today, and see if it's jogged any memories of things in the past. If you have questions, be more than happy to answer them. Give me some time to look them up, but I'll get that back to you, and hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.